Every once in a while, I escape Miami, usually to Denver for a few years, and then I come right back home. And now I've bought a home here, as I was mentioning to Glima, so I'll be here for a good long while. I started off as the president of a local high school Democrats club, worked with a local organization, or not worked, volunteered with a local organization called Democracy for America, Miami-Dade. Was sort of peripherally involved with the Democrats of South Dade Club. And then, went to college and took a couple different jobs. I worked for SEIU. I did Teach for America immediately post-college. And so I've worked in a couple of different roles now with different organizations. And I would say that the one thing that I have sort of always taken for granted and was still pretty shocked by last year was sort of the way that, having worked in the electoral system for a good long while, the way that folks decided to just not accept the results of an election altogether, which is a little bit shocking. But it was something that I had been working on at just in terms of like doing election protection. It really shouldn't have been as shocking given some of the comments that we had been hearing, and some of the other pieces that some of the Trump loyalists had been floating. But it's also the buildup of decades worth of a trajectory of both corporate power, and also just generally the polarization in our politics that continues to get worse on both sides of the aisle. So it was for me personally, it was a little bit of an eye opener last year as to where we wound up. But yeah, that's a little bit about myself, I would say. I don't know if folks have any questions, and if not, I'm happy to dive in.
Go for it, Franco.
Oh, Duncan, did you have a question?
Yes, I've wanted to connect with the Democrats. I'm a Democrat, and I've done canvassing for every one of the campaigns
Gotcha.
beforehand. But they meet at the Unitarian Church here. But I'm not sure if that's the only organization or there's another one. There'd be
Well,
some way to
the
combine.
folks who I work with, or the local club that I'm a part of and that I'm the president of, is the South Dade Democrats organization. We meet the third Monday of every month. We are trying to make it permanently at the Unitarian Church. So we'll be there next Monday at 7 p.m. And it's a good group of organization and of people who have been around for decades in some cases, just really trying to make the sort of South Dade, Pinecrest, Palmetto Bay area more progressive and a little bit bluer. So that's my plug for the club on that front. But it is a good group of folks who are highly active. We'd love to have you, Duncan, and if you want to shoot me an email, I'll put my email my email in the chat later on as well. It's not very hard. It's my last name, Caliz, franco@gmail.com, but I'll put it in the chat so we can reach out and have your contact info.
Monday at 7:00.
Yep, you got it.
Okay, it's simple enough for me. Thanks.
Yeah. I don't know if other folks want to say hello. I know we had a couple of folks jump in.
Hi, Jane.
Or I can roll. I can roll in if you want, whatever your preference is.
Okay.
All right.
Go for it.
I'll dive in. Cool. Can everybody see where it says protecting democracy? The screen over here? Cool. So I think this has really been the last few months, and probably the last year, I would say, has really been a good time to sort of analyze what happened both before, during, and after the last election, dating not just to January 6th, but really even if you look at January 5th, the day before, when Democrats actually won in Georgia, which was sort of one of those additional pieces that sort of built up the response that happened. It seems to me as though our democratic norms are being frayed in a way that they haven't since really the Civil War in a lot of ways. There are a lot of folks predicting that, in fact, there will be a civil war that is coming up. Our neighbors to the north, the Canadians, are releasing a lot of documentation and a lot of sort of analysis around how the glue that holds this country is fraying and is likely to collapse, and how they need to prepare both their systems and also their populace for this. And we're actually starting to see some of this go international with the current activities of truckers trying to block the pass in and out of Canada and into the United States. Mexico recently released a special report from their Attorney General talking about reverse migration from the United States and what that would likely look like in a situation where systems really sort of started to break down here in the United States. So we're starting to see more and more of our neighbors actually take this as like a real serious threat. I would say that there's really sort of 5 features and examples of limits on democracy that we're starting to see. One of them is the limits on freedom of expression. The perfect example is actually, unfortunately, here in Florida with Governor DeSantis's recent piece of legislation that was passed and signed into law that basically makes it so that large groups of people cannot congregate. It seems very targeted, for particularly aimed at Black folks. And when we started to see Republican protests or demographics protesting that were likely to be beneficial to Republicans, we ended up seeing that the state, in this case, did not pursue the actual letter of the law and sort of let whatever happened go forth. The second piece, also something Florida took the lead on, which is just making voting itself harder. And this is, ranging from voter ID requirements to reducing the ability of people to do vote by mail, matching signatures a little bit more. So, for folks who may have scribbled one way their signature when they were signing up to vote, and who decades later or years later end up changing the way that they sign, if things don't match, they'll change this. There's currently an election happening right now in Texas. And what we're seeing is that vote by mail there is become a real pain point because the signatures aren't matching. So 38% of all ballots that have been sent in Houston, Texas, which is not exactly a small city, have been returned and declared invalid so far. That's almost 1 out of every 4, or 4 out of every 10 ballots that has been turned in at this point from a major Democratic city. So of course, the impact that this has is it has an overwhelming effect in A, benefiting one party, the Republicans, and B, in reducing the power of largely Hispanic and Black constituencies in the city of Houston. The other thing that I would mention is, the general creation of distrust in election results. And at this point, we've almost incorporated this into our daily, like, even if it's a joke, but you hear something from your spouse or if you're a friend and you say, oh, fake news. This is how much it's permeated sort of popular culture and our own society in the way that we just talk about these things. But you'll see somewhere in the realm of 45 to 70, depending on the poll, % of Republicans saying that they do not accept Joe Biden as the legitimate president right now. So that it's just one of those additional pieces where I'm always sort of blown away by the success that the credibility of elections has been sort of shaken. And to play the both sidesism that perhaps is morally unfair on this side, Democrats had some of this too after 2016 with the investigation on Russia and the Ukraine, and ties into the Trump campaign as well. I think if you look at 2000, maybe one really sort of a constitutional crisis point in some ways, where the Supreme Court ended up having to make a decision, some real decisions around what the recount in Bush v. Gore looked like. Democrats still sort of accepted those results in a way that we're just not seeing at this point, 2 decades on from that. The other one is really an embrace of violence, and we're starting to see more and more people say that violence is an acceptable way of expressing legitimate political grievance. You have a whole political party who's basically saying that January 6th's insurrection last year at the Capitol is a form of legitimate political speech. And beyond that, you just generally see an attitude, and we'll cover that in a little bit, showing more and more folks saying, well, if things aren't done to protect the country, then it's okay to use violence. And what things being done to protect the country really means is, if things that fit my ideological interests are not done, then it's okay to use violence. And then a big part of this is also just the way that partisanship and race both exacerbate these factors. So I wanted to talk through a little bit. These are states where Republicans gained ground in 2010, and then where voter laws that were restrictive passed. So you can see it's a pretty heavy subset of places. And the two most democratic areas of the country, the West Coast and the Northeast, are sort of the places where you didn't see the Republican gains the way that you did in many of the other areas. So you don't see those states having these sorts of laws in the book. This is as of November of 2019. So you'll see a couple more of these actually are starting to change, namely Michigan and Pennsylvania. We talked about the big lie and the fact that, some folks still want to say that Trump won the election. These are the actual sort of policy effects that this has had. Limiting of voting options, including, places like Texas, actually, since I mentioned them earlier, had drop-off locations that were available 24/7. So if it was 3 a.m. and that's when you got off of work and that's when you could drop your mail-in ballot off, you were able to do that last cycle. That's no longer the case in Texas because of the law that recently passed there. So with the exception of Vermont and Maine, 48 states have reduced voting options. In terms of expanding voter ID, which tends to affect the most impoverished communities, namely Native Americans, and you'll see North Dakota, South Dakota, Kansas are on here, tends to go after Black communities as well. So you'll see North Carolina, Tennessee, Tennessee and North Carolina are two of the very few states that don't include Black voters, or that include large numbers of Black voters that are not included on here. But you'll see the entire rest of the South, for example, was targeted here. And then the other places that you'll see are sort of the swing states. You'll see Arizona, Nevada, Colorado, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, all places that have been really competitive recently, have all expanded voter ID requirements because of the Republican state legislatures. The amount of time that folks actually have to vote, again, you'll see a fair amount of red states and potentially swing states that are doing this as well. And one of the most heinous versions of this is actually the voter rolls. So this is, if I didn't vote the last election or didn't vote the last 3 years in some cases, they'll just take your name off the voter rolls. We experienced a lot of this in Georgia. My organization does significant work out there. Dating back to 2018, there's a civic organization called the New Georgia Project Action Fund that we work with. And, we went and knocked on doors, talked to voters, and saw what the folks that we needed to go out and turn out to win there were talking about. There was mass confusion about whether or not people were still registered to vote. Polling places were changed at the last second, but the most common thing that we heard was this: my name has been removed from the voting rolls and I am no longer registered. I never received any sort of notification telling me that I am no longer registered. So it was really sort of shocking to me to see how prevalent this was throughout a lot of the Black community in Atlanta, where their names were just completely removed. The limiting or criminalizing of election officials. So this is if something is wrong with the tabulation, and it might just be a small clerical error, that's been criminalized as well, which of course means less people want to sign up for those sorts of roles. It means that it is likely to be more white people, frankly, and white people that are generally male are the ones who end up taking those roles instead, because the criminal system is less likely to punish them. And then you see create or reinforcing partisan election roles. So this is when your Secretary of Elections is no longer a nonpartisan entity, but instead is a very much partisan person who is actually administering the election. That means it's less likely, and especially look at Georgia and Arizona, two of the states that were under challenge last time, as places that are now changing their laws to actually create roles that are going to be more and more partisan. So this is all sort of effects of the big lie. We talked a little bit about the Trump movement. This is not Republican, so I just want to be very clear about this. These are folks who were part of the Make America Great Again page on Facebook. This was the original draft Trump page. So it's a subset of Republican voters, but it's a pretty large subset of Republican voters, and it's pretty representative of what we're seeing from some of the more sort of hardy supporters of the president. One, the distrust of the results from the last election, you'll see nearly 100%. the parts that sort of shock me a little bit more, the believe voting shouldn't be easier is above 80% on this. The part where they want a third term for Donald Trump, so they actually believe that he deserves 2 more terms because the first term was challenged unfairly, is over 65%. So, just one of those things where it's worth noting how partisanship and race in a lot of ways sort of interchange and interplay. This is what I was talking about earlier, the embrace of political violence. If elected leaders won't protect America, the people must act, even if that means violence. It scares me that there's 17% of people among Democrats who are willing to say that this is how they feel. So that I do want to know, that's bad. It scares me a heck of a lot more that almost 40% of Republicans are also saying that this is the case, because this is a lot of what you'll hear from people who are actually saying the reason why we had to do what we did on January 6th was because of this. The reason we were chanting "Hang Mike Pence" was because it was a leader who wouldn't do the right thing. So you're able to actually see some of these different sort of interplays. This is the other thing. It's one of the reasons why a lot of people said, well, Biden got elected because he's willing to reach across the aisle. He has this moderate temperament, that kind of thing. But if you look at it, there is a huge decline in the amount of people who actually want compromise amongst the people who are registered on in the political party. And you'll oftentimes hear, well, what does unity with a Republican actually mean for me? And this is amongst Democrats, right? And if you hear, and I've heard this even today. Actually, today I heard this from somebody who said, well, I'm a Black person. When I say Black Lives Matters and that's challenged, how am I supposed to find unity with a Republican? I think there's a real moral question, some real ethical things in there that we should consider, but it does talk about how frayed our polity is at this point. Race, to me, is one of the clearest factors. The higher someone scores on ethnic antagonism, the more they are likely to support anti-democratic statements. Not surprising if you tend to believe that Black people or brown people or people of any subset are inferior or not as worthy as you, you're less likely to believe that they should have a role in governance, right? And so what we see is they'll find other ways to sort of defend those statements and defend those actions when the other side wins. So whether it's people saying that it's hard to trust elections, that the use of force is a way to save lives, right? That strong leaders, it's okay when a strong leader bends rules because they're doing what's right. And there is a higher correlation amongst Republicans for racial antagonism than amongst Democrats. What does this mean? It means that you are likelier to see some of these defenses, especially the last one on here, take the law into our own hands amongst Republicans than it is amongst Democrats, because there is more racial antagonism. And one of the places we most clearly have seen this has actually been after Barack Obama's election. So in 2008 was the closest that was the worst performance that Republicans have benefited from white folks. So if you look at the graph on that front, they're almost flat. It's almost equal. Ever since, you've really started to see divergence between support for Democrats and white folks, and a lot of it comes from the white lash that has resulted out of that. Gleam, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just Duncan popped something to the chat.
Oh, sorry.
The colors are not, I know that they're right beside these pieces, but if you could just,
Yeah,
I can't really see the colors.
Got it. So the red one over here is it's hard to trust elections is the statement on that one. Let me clear this really quickly here. The next one on here, which is sort of this gray line here. Went forward, my bad. So the gray line here is the use of force is okay if you're going to save lives. And this is really couched within the point of view of abortion. The question was couched within choice. The next one, which is this purple line that begins here and ends here, is that it's okay to take the law into your own hands when leaders aren't doing what is good for the country. And then this green one here that begins here and is actually the lowest one now is that it is okay for strong leaders to bend rules. Does that help, Duncan? Oh, okay. If I see anything from Duncan or if anything else comes up, Glima, let me know, and I'll keep going from there. You're muted, Glima and Duncan. You're both muted, so.
Duncan, can you unmute yourself? You had a quick question?
Yeah, sorry. What's that? And are these psychological tests on the bottom, going from left to right, that axis?
Yeah. So this actually
people
comes
submitted
from,
to the survey and the
yeah, I can.
and,
Since I can't see my my notes right now, I can't tell you exactly the name of where it came from. I can come back to it at the end if that's okay. But it's from a study I believe that Princeton did. So I can double back on that front. So this is how Black folks are actually responding to everything we're seeing. This comes from a study from a consulting group that worked with one of our partners in Georgia. This is a Democratic voter, Black man, over the age of 45. And this is how he's perceiving these different actions that are being done. The passing laws attacking our freedom. Again, they're trying to suppress our vote. That's why they are making laws now for us not to be able to vote. Again, we're turning red states into blue, and they are realizing that now. So they're going to try everything in their power to make sure that don't happen again in the next election. So they always try to do everything to suppress our vote. That's why they don't want to give out anything. And give out anything, for those who aren't aware, in Georgia, the governor recently signed a law saying that if you pass bottles of water out to anybody, food to anybody, anything along those lines, I forget what it is, but it's a felony. It's a felony charge that you actually get hit with. When we have long lines, they don't want to help out because they are trying to suppress us from voting. One of the things that was interesting was we had a donor, one of our donors, very wealthy person, who's based out of DeKalb County in Georgia, is on the sort of the wealthier side of that. Walked in, voted, white person, not a problem. Drove 15 minutes down to one of the poor areas, 2-hour lines because it was a Black voting district and is the blackest, one of the blackest precincts in the area, right? And so they were saying, this is how I benefit from privilege, even on election day, as they were going through. So, we see this over and over again in that. And again, we just in sort of talking a little bit more about the way that our system is actually set up. Democratic senators right now represent 40 million more voters than the Republican counterparts. This is just the way that the Senate is actually laid out, right? 15 states with 38 million people combined elect 38 Republican senators. California, one state, 40 million residents elects 2 Democrats. You could literally put California into those 15 states and still have 2 million residents left over. So that's a little bit of how unbalanced our existing Senate structure is in the Senate. And it's a reminder too that the Senate, and Gleam and I were talking about this before folks came on, the Senate itself is not a democratic institution. It was originally done to cool the hot tempers of the House, was the way that the founders described it. The Senate itself was not directly elected by people. It was elected by state legislatures. And mechanisms like the filibuster were also designed in the 1870s, not when the Senate was originally done, so that it would actually help pause some of the Black Reconstruction era senators from being able to pass legislation as well. So the history of the filibuster itself is pretty nefarious from the very origins of it. And today, we obviously see it when Republicans all vote in mass or all plan in mass to vote against the bill, and then they're joined by folks like Senator Manchin to stop voting rights from bills such as the John Lewis Act or the For the People Act to pass, which would actually reform and expand some of the access to the franchise. One of the things that most scares me, by 2040, 70% of the country will be represented by 30 senators. The remaining Americans, who are going to be disproportionately whiter, older, and more rural, will have 70. So we're heading to an era now of rule by a minority, the way that things currently are laid out. This is a CNN poll that came out, I believe, on Friday of last week. It's pretty eye-opening. 56% of Democrats saw it likely that an election would soon be overturned versus 48% of Republicans. In September, it was almost inverse on that front. 56% of respondents said that they had little or no confidence that American elections will reflect the will of the people. So that is ticking up pretty consistently, including 16% higher since just January of last year. 3/4 of Republicans were now skeptical that elections are representative. And frankly, up to a third of Democrats are along for the ride on that part. 60% of independents agree with that. The other piece is that, and this is kind of a counterbalance, less Americans are now saying that American democracy is under attack than they did last summer. So the distance from what happened in January is actually causing people to sort of believe that that is legitimate forms of political disagreement. I think I can send this over to you, Glima, to post up if you want, but there are a couple of podcasts that I would really suggest listening to, one from 538, one from Vox, both about the state of American democracy and where we're going. Some folks make the argument that despite the stress test that came in from January of 6th of last year, that the systems actually worked, and that because there were enough checks and balances, that the right people in the right places stepped up, and because of that, no electors were sort of overthrown, and we ended up having the correct result. And so that is proof that American democracy is healthy. And then there are some folks who say the fact that you have to defend any of that means that American democracy is not healthy. But so I wanted to run over this. I know it's a discussion, so I didn't want to take all of the time up for us to chat. But I did think that those were some of the key sort of overviews of how those things interplayed. I'm happy to answer any questions from folks. And I'll stop sharing. I did want to answer what you were saying earlier. It's a Vanderbilt professor, statistical analysis of a survey of Republican voters, analyzing the link between their scores on a measure of ethnic antagonism and their support for 4 anti-democratic statements. The clearest part of the finding was that the higher a voter scores on ethnic antagonism, the more likely they are to support anti-democratic ideas. This was even true after regression analysis, comparing racial attitudes to other predictors like support for Trump. So if that's helpful about how there is an interplay between race and sort of anti-democratic thought. But yeah, I'm happy to hear your thoughts, hear where you're at. And then I have a couple of small scale solutions that I'd be happy to offer to folks as well. But would love to hear your impressions and thoughts. Glima, I don't know how you typically moderate these, so I'll pass it over to you.
Yeah, I don't know if anyone's comfortable in popping their hand up under reactions. That may be a good way to do it. Otherwise, just unmute yourselves and speak up. And if it gets...
I'd like to say something.
All right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. The feelings that flashed in my mind when you were presenting all this information was that, yes, this is all horrible. This is all horrible. I agree that it's horrible. I do not believe that American democracy is healthy. But I have heard these complaints so many times in the past. So many times in the past. And complaining is not enough. Whenever I think of what it is that we need to do in order to solve this problem, there are 3 things that Americans need to do. Vote in huge numbers, protest in massive numbers, run in office and run for office in massive numbers. That's it. We have to use the mechanisms of democracy to protect American democracy. What happened there? Something just...
I think somebody just came in.
Just came.
Oh, okay. So yeah, we have to use the mechanisms of democracy to protect American democracy. And that's it. And all of those things, in one way or another, are difficult. Because you mentioned that, Franco, you mentioned that Republicans are making it difficult to vote in some states. So yeah, that's going to be difficult. It's going to be difficult to protest in massive numbers. First of all, it's difficult to get people motivated to protest in huge numbers. But even when they do, there's always the possibility of being arrested and being charged with trumped up charges. And running for office, well, that requires some guts and some money. But unless those three things are going to happen, then things are just going to get worse. They're just going to get worse. And while discussion groups like this are interesting, they don't solve the problem. They do not solve the problem. And I'm not trying to offend you, Franco. Please don't think that. I'm just trying to state a fact that I sincerely believe to be true.
I hear you. So I think I'm going to go to James, and then I'm going to go to Duncan, because I think that's the order in which I saw hands going up. So James?
Yeah, I have on the list of numbers there, I have a question about creating distrust in election results. A lot of the media, a lot of the groups, different organizations and everything try to sway you one way or another. And then people read books written by the politicians that have been in office complaining about things. How do you think, in terms of unity, when you want the mass of the people to go out and vote, say, for a Democratic candidate or an independent candidate, how do you encourage trust among those voters? I mean, they're facing the restrictions now. They're facing why some states limit your ability to vote easily. But still, I mean, to me, distrust is something that could be among the people going to vote. So how would, say, the Democratic Party encourage trust among the voters?
Well, I think there's a couple. That's a great question. I think there's a couple of things that can be done from the party apparatuses. One, I think too often in fundraising, in particular, we use language, and I hate this language, so I'm very, very happy to call it out when I see it. It's over. This is literally a message that I've gotten. It's over. Franco, the Republican Marco Rubio has done X, Y, and Z, and now it doesn't help. Like, that's not going to motivate people, and it makes them distrust and want to vote less. Going to Luis's point, right? It makes people distrust what is happening more. I think there's the ability to say, and this is something that I also saw while looking at a couple of articles. There's a difference between creating and saying, I have a political rival and I have a political enemy, right? And there are enemies that are threatening my way of life. And I think too often politicians, parties sort of go into a way where the most hyperbolic language then becomes the thing that is quoted by the media, the thing that gets the most clicks and that is most heard. I believe actually a couple of days ago, forgetting her actual name, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says something like, I think it's the end of democracy as we know it, or something like that, right? That's the most, if you search American democracy as a Google term all of this weekend, that was the one thing that popped up for everybody. So too often the thing that happens is that the way we talk about the issues or the stakes for the campaign pit us against one another, not just in the realm of political rivalry, but in the realm of like personal enmity, of the realm of sort of a clash of civilizations, for lack of a better way of putting it, that actually hurts us on that end. It's okay when we have differences in policy. It's a lot harder when you have differences in policy and you don't believe that the people who are making decisions are the people who are entitled to be making those decisions based off of actual votes. And so there can be, I think, an opportunity for grounding around how it is that we're able to both talk to our own base of voters and our own supporters, as well as how we present the stakes for an election as well.
Because on your map was interesting, because the percentage, what was it here? Let me just give me a second. It was 38 million people represented the senators. And then you go on to say that 2040, 70% represent 30 senators. Now, are you referring, is that all the senators there are, or is that just the Democratic senators?
No, that's
How
all.
many-
So basically, that's a total of senators, not just Democratic senators. So it's by 2040, 70% of the country will be represented by 30 senators.
So the voters population is almost going to double by 2040, but you don't know if they'll be supporting the Democrats or the Republicans.
Right. But this is more a testament to the fact that the urbanization and sort of the megalopolis effect that we're seeing, where cities are just growing, suburbs are growing, and rural areas are sort of being more and more abandoned than it necessarily is about specific population growth trends.
All right, thank you. Yeah, no, I sort of agree. I think it's a cultural clash right now, trying to decide what to do with, President Biden is doing a good job, but still there's doubt being raised by the news and the stories that could put distrust in the voters, whether they want to take a chance with President Biden or go with somebody else. So I think it's a cultural clash. I thank you for answering my question.
And one thing that I didn't really mention as much on here that is worth noting is also for Latinos in particular. Latinos are the group that is most online. We use mobile apps more than anybody else. Let me pull up one. I'm actually writing a memo for work that will be public in a couple of days. But young Hispanics 18 to 34 are twice as likely to use WhatsApp and Telegram as the general population. Also worth noting, Latinos in general make up the largest group of users for WhatsApp because it's how we communicate with folks back in our home countries as well. And these young Hispanics 18 to 34 are also the heaviest users for Instagram and Discord as well. So you're also seeing places where there's much more opportunity for misinformation. And these are closed networks, right? So if we're all on a WhatsApp group, it's not like I can just pop in and see what's going on. Somebody has to invite me in there. And that means that it's one of those places where misinformation and disinformation run rampant and it's hard to combat as well. So you're also starting to see how different groups are being targeted by this. I know that, for example, in the Chinese community, this is a major issue as well in 2020 at the national level. So Duncan, I think you were next.
I had a few things I wanted to contribute. And I didn't want to go dissertate on it or anything, but just things to parameters in which we can think about these things. Starting with the Senate versus the House, and like your analogy was really good there. And the Senate is supposed to be a dampener, and I guess the Senate is more like accounting of real estate, because you have places like Wyoming, and they have mineral wealth and so forth. They don't have too many people in it, and so that makes that state very few people can control politics there and give their votes in the Senate. Compared to the what you have in the populous states where you have only 2 senators, and but that's something you really can't change. I mean, you'd have to change the Constitution for that, and if we want to be literal about the Constitution, we can't go around changing things just to fit, suit one group or another, even if it's a lot of hungry people, or people that are underrepresented. And the other thing I wanted to just suggest as something, a parameter we could use is whether we're going to talk about these things on a personal level or on a mass level. People don't like to hear about having 1.23 or 2.3 children per couple or something like that. I mean, that there's some they're big families and other ones are selectively small. And similarly on the geographic thing, we have talk about these red states, but these red states are also ones that have been hollowed out because of all the foreign trade that we've had and the disadvantages we've had there, and that the red state mayors and governors weren't very good at finding alternative jobs for these, and their own governments sometimes were outsourcing outside of the country, for things just to save a buck. And then there are the cultural things, like I think Jerry Lewis, as early as 1970 or something, I guess, said in the Jack Paar show or something like that, he enjoyed pissing over Mississippi when you're flying in the air in an airliner. And they have that attitude. I mean, the person's the coasties, versus the hicks in the inside, and that's a big divide that we have. And then we have the one with race, where a lot of people, well, this is an old thing from the South. I mean, before the Civil War and after it, Reconstruction, and up till the Civil Rights Act and beyond, this mendacity where they will argue, or people that argue, they don't care about the truth as much as they care about having their way, and people agree with that. I mean, so that's another factor that we have with this. And then the education, people get high school degrees without really knowing. I mean, they think that Atlanta is a state, and they think that the president is the commander-in-chief of the country. And we even have, like, the PBS News, that they slip with that, and they call the president the commander-in-chief. I mean, commander-in-chief, they did that when Trump was president. I mean, and he's not my commander-in-chief. I was a naval reservist for about 10 years, and I took and he was my the president was my commander-in-chief then, but I'm not on military duty. And it's only with respect to time of war, really, that the president is. Then we have the business of how the presidential debates used to be a very organized things, almost like a college debate. And look what happened then when we had the one with, there was a Trump versus Biden, and how Trump was all over the place, and you had this half-baked, you can't really call him a journalist from Fox News, was the moderator of that thing, and no discipline was kept.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting too that we're starting to see that Republicans have actually written to the presidential debate, or I believe it's a presidential debate commission, and they've actually said that we don't want to participate in debates next time if this is the way that things are held. So that's another one of those norms that is sort of starting to be frayed a little bit, is the tradition for the collegiality around these around these debates as well.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks for answering that. And anything else, I'm done with that. I just thought, I mean, these are things that are happening.
Yeah,
and you have this masked debate that goes on. Black Lives Matter, of course they do. Of course they matter. So these people picked the wrong slogan, and because there's an instant refutation of that is, of course, every person's matter. I go to my evangelical church, and we all agree, in Jesus and everything else. So I mean, so that's basically they're trying to get something else, but they didn't name their cause properly.
Well, I would push back gently on that by saying, yes, I think we can all agree that every person has inherent worth, but I think we can also agree that Black lives in this country have inherently been devalued by both an economic system that literally kept them enslaved for hundreds of years since 1612, right? And then we've sort of have done a soft system of that, where we are within the context even of this conversation targeting African American areas, targeting Black areas, to make it so that it's harder for them to vote, so that they have longer lines, so that they have to show voter ID, so that they have to show these other pieces. So yes, well, I think we all agree that every life is worth saving and precious. I think we can also agree that there are systematic pieces that this country has placed Black people under, and the name Black Lives Matter is done to actually call attention to the fact of how Black lives are actually impacted by so many. How is that
going to recruit a Midwestern farmer who's losing his farm?
Well,
to economic things, and all he has is his or the West Virginia country. I don't have a good word.
Coal miner, yeah, sure, but yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I would. So the thing that I would say here is that there was an actual. There was a campaign that sort of a messaging campaign that was run a couple of years ago in Minnesota, and it was one of the most effective ones. And Gleam, I see you, so I'm going to you next. But one of this campaign in Minnesota was really interesting. It was called, what was it? I'm trying to remember. It's a tactic for turning out votes and for sort of disarming sort of white lash, for lack of a better way of putting it, and trying to build these unities amongst different racial groups. And so what this does is it says it brings a unifying message, and it also puts blame on specific people. And so it's called the race class narrative, is what the name of the actual tactic is called. The lead proponent of it is called Anat Shenker-Osorio. If you Google her, there's a ton of material out from her. She's been on a bunch of podcasts, including, I believe, one of the New York Times one. And one of the things that they do is they say, hey, look, and there's a great ad. I wish I had the ability to Google it right now to post it on here. But it says, whether you're native born to Minnesota or a Somali immigrant, for example, they've got a large population of Somalis in Minnesota now. One of the things we can all agree that wages need to be higher, that whatever, our kids need better education, and that puppies are cute. I forgot the exact thing, right? Here's the three things. And then they'll say, and we also know that the system is currently rigged against most of us, right? And so it takes in that economic grievance. So that's where it unites on the racial side, brings in the class side by saying, hey, we're most of us are working ourselves to the bone every day, right? Meanwhile, the really wealthy corporations are generally doing very well for themselves and not giving back enough to the American worker. And it's actually the thing that we most saw have success anywhere in the country to bring Republican and rural voters and turning out for Democratic candidates. We then tried it again in Pennsylvania, or we saw it in Pennsylvania. I did not run program in Pennsylvania last cycle, and it also had success there. So there's now a little bit of a formula out there to try to bring a little bit of that unity that James was talking about, and to try to make it so that the message, it comes from a disarming sort of way and doesn't immediately sort of raise partisan hackles, and can actually start to bond together people of different racial groups. One of the things I learned when I was teaching that will forever stay with me is that a poor Black person, a poor Black child, has more in common with a poor white peer than they do with a well-off Black child. Class is sort of the thing that we don't talk about a lot in this country, and knowing how much money somebody makes is sort of like a hidden thing that we don't talk about, even at work oftentimes. But it is one of the things that we see repeatedly actually sort of create cleavages even amongst different communities that are really deep. And so being able to sort of attract the Midwestern farmer or the Ohio factory worker is something that we can do if we message and we talk to people the right way. And a lot of that actually comes from using trusted messengers, from being authentic in the messaging that we're doing. So yes, this is the place where, like, if you're Hillary Clinton and you're putting out advertisements that say that you're like my abuela, I'm sorry, Hillary, I think you would have been a great president. You have nothing in common with my abuela who grew up in Nicaragua, right? Like, that is not authentic. So all of these pieces to say there are tactics that sort of can build unity and can also try to make it so that we can go after what I'll call the Kansasification, right, of America, where we try to shrink social services. We try to make it so that it becomes really, really small government that you can drown in a bathtub. And then you realize that you can't open the libraries anymore because you don't have the funds for it, and you can't keep the stoplights on, right? Which is literally what happened in Kansas and why it's competitive out there. This is like the work that we do, and we test these messages over and over and over again with different constituency groups. Race class narrative actually works the best of any of them for that reason, because it actually takes in people's lived experiences, highlights the differences, and it says we can still come together around some really basic pieces. So to answer a little bit of your question, Perry, in the chat of how do we reverse some of this decline, it really is about using messaging that still is issue driven, but that doesn't necessarily A, have a partisan label on it, and B, that can allow for actual communication between people, that allows for room for open answers instead of just a sort of a closed yes and no debate, which is what we often see in our politics. Sorry, Glima, that was the longest answer I'll ever give in my life. So.
I actually don't want to ask a question. I wanted to make sure that other people who have questions get a chance. Anyone? I have a question too, but I'll hold off to the end. Perry, did you want to actually say something instead of just have it on the chat?
Well, you know, I think the divisiveness between the parties is just leading to a lot of hate, and that is not a good thing. And I agree with you, Franco, that we have to figure out a messaging to bridge the divide, to understand each other, to see each other as human beings, to find a common ground. And you know, all the messages I get from all the politicians are about fight, 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 and these are the terrible things that the other side is doing, all of which may be true, but that doesn't help to solve the problem, you know? And it's very frustrating to get 10 emails a day from Democrats saying the same thing. You know, give me money, fight, fight, fight. Do you believe what these bastards just did? You know, it's discouraging.
And I just want to point out, at work, a lot of what I do is fundraising. So I do political strategy, but as part of that, guess what? Without money, I can't run program, right? So that's part of what I do. One of the practices that I absolutely despise is the way that Democrats have created this model of fundraising that really is sort of a fear-driven approach to, and it makes no sense. Hey, so I'm just gonna pick on somebody. Miguel, if you give me $5, I can push against the Koch brothers who just raised $2 million. Every time I read that, like my brain explodes because I'm just like, you understand the math doesn't work here, right? Like that's not a compelling story to tell to people. I do want to show something really quick because I actually found it. So I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Let me know if you can hear the audio. If the audio doesn't work, then I'll just post a link in the chat. But give me 1 second and hopefully this will work.
In Minnesota, we know long winters, and we know how to dig our neighbors out of the snow. Because whether it's our first Minnesota winter or our 50th, we've all been there. So when certain politicians want to divide us and make us afraid, we know that means they've got nothing else to offer. We're on to them. There are lots of ways to be Minnesotan, and all of them are greater than fear. In Minnesota, we're better off together. Vote greater than fear between now and November 6th.
Great.
So that was one of the, that was
Super.
the highest performing ad that we saw in the entire Midwest in the 2018 cycle. And this was obviously in Minnesota. It was aimed at really turning out significant numbers of sort of inner urban area folks. So yes, it was a largely Black community, but the Black community there, like I said, has a lot of Somali immigrants and their kids who are coming of age now. But also because Minnesota's just not that big, that media market also includes very white rural areas at times. And this was the top performing ad. Now you saw this was unifying, said go out and vote, implicitly talked about if whether this is your 50th year in Minnesota or your first year, which is a little bit of a nod to that immigrant community. And also, you know, as people are taking off sort of their winter gear, you see the different nationalities. There's also, I believe, it's a large Cambodian and Vietnamese population out there that's emerging in that area. So that you saw a gentleman from there as well. There's just ways to do advertising in ways that is actually helpful and can unify people and allows for you to then follow up from this conversation with issue-based conversations saying, hey, we really care about the minimum wage. I'm just going to keep picking the minimum wage because it's one of those things that's popular. It doesn't matter what part of the party, what party you are, right? And that opens up those gates and the avenues for that conversation. And that as a Democrat, right, personally, I can still go in and say, hey, we're the party that wants to raise the minimum wage. We've been the party that's fighting for you, right? Come join us. Come join all of these different people in a way that isn't going to make people feel like I'm saying, oh, well, because you're a Republican, you're terrible, and you know you're trying to make sure that people are going hungry or whatever. Like that's not a message that is ever going to allow me to actually have a conversation with somebody.
So when is that view going to become mainstream Democratic strategy?
I think it's one that's growing. I'll be honest in saying that I asked, so obviously I work on what is called the independent side of campaigns. So I cannot coordinate in any way, shape or form directly with candidates. right? It's like a legal barrier. So I work for one of those evil super PACs is the best way I can frame it to y'all, right? The flip side of it is at the end of a cycle, we can get together. And so we sat down along with a lot of other folks, and the Biden campaign was there. The Florida Democrats were there. Here in this state, this is a tactic that has not run at any sort of scale so far. And to me, it's one of the greatest missed opportunities that our party has had, because you have a tactic that can bring people from different backgrounds together. I've run a bunch of studies here in Florida. Florida Latinos very different than Western Latinos, very different than Northeast Latinos. Yep. White voters sort of still hold on to a lot of the Southern rural beliefs that Black voters here tend to think a lot like Black voters in Georgia. Southern Black voters, unfortunately, have been stepped on for a long time. And sort of you see this mixture of hope and despair and sense of duty to the country and to one another, and to this concept of Black power. It's really interesting. It's actually an area that's really fertile for a message like this. It's growing. This was used in a lot more places last cycle. I think from what I've heard, it's going to be used a little bit more here in Florida this time. So Perry, to answer your question, hopefully it's growing a little bit more in steam, because there is actual analytical data. There is testing that has happened in multiple places now, and it might have to be revised here and there. One thing that I will acknowledge is the dudes here have talked a lot. Gender is sort of the piece that hasn't been mentioned around all of this. We've done a lot of testing, and for whatever reason, race, class, yes, that works. When we insert gender into this formula, doesn't work. So we're still trying to figure out how we talk about gender in a way that is inviting and that sort of can continue to develop these conversations. We haven't cracked the code yet. And it's not a bunch of dudes. My digital director and the person who I was mentioning earlier are women. It's just something we're trying to sort of figure out on that.
It's like talking about abortion, gender and abortion, right? I mean, where do you find common ground there? It's like, how pregnant are you?
Right. So it's one of those things we're working on. I know we're coming up on the hour, so I just wanted to say my solutions to this are a little bit where Luis was. So Luis, I do talk about it to groups like this, but I also practice the actual political side of it as well. And my solutions for folks sitting here tonight are a couple of different things. One, yes, vote, as you said, but also keep an eye on down ballot races. I bet all of you can at least know one or two things that the US Senate did, but how many of you can tell me something that your Secretary of State did? Because they're the ones who actually managed the election, right? How many of you can name who the Secretary of State is for Florida? So I would just say things like that are really important to keep in mind as we're voting and as we're looking at these different races. Down ballot races tend to impact your lives a hell of a lot more than the presidential race or than the Senate does or any of these other places. So keeping an eye, because one of the things that we're seeing, and I didn't include it on here, is the amount of sort of January 6th insurgent types who are now running for office is actually kind of crazy and insane. There are a lot of these people. There's over 100 candidates who were in the Capitol on January 6th who are running for office this cycle. So it's worth knowing that, and it's worth trying to make sure that you know who you're voting for, who are the school board people, who are the folks who are running for commissions and city councils, and some of the smaller races that don't seem as important. The second thing that I would say is call your representatives, be involved and engage in that way. Even if you feel like they're not listening, that means that their corporate backers actually have to hear a lot more on the back end of this. It's one of those things that I see and then go through on that front. And then the last part I'll say is talk to your friends and your family, even when it can be infuriating, even when it's annoying. I know the vice president of my club, her best friend is out in Massachusetts, but she's a very big Trump supporter. And I'm always like, you got to keep talking to her. The one sort of silver bullet that my job has figured out, and it works better frankly with people of color communities, so Black, Latino, AAPI communities, is this: leveraging relationships that are already in place is better than giving anybody a list. And there are a bunch of tools that can do this. And if folks are interested, again, I can post my email on here. In fact, I'll do that right now because I did promise that I would do that at some point. But I just want to say, you know, there are apps out there that show you where people are registered to vote, whether they're in a swing district or not, whether they've requested a vote by mail ballot, whether or not they've returned the vote by mail ballot. And this is all public information, right? And using those sorts of tools to actually guide your conversations with friends come election time is a hell of a lot easier and a hell of a lot more useful than getting a cold list from me and telling you, hey, go dial these 30 people, pray to God that 2 of them answers, and that 1 of the 2 that answers doesn't tell you, you know, where you can stick the phone. Like, it just, that's not an effective way of campaigning. And it's also really poor organizing. If we ultimately want to say, like, talk to your neighbors, that's not the right way to do it. It's actually by talking to the people you know and developing those relationships. I'm going to go to Chris Kirchner, and then I'm going to go to Christine, and then I'm going to go to James, if that's all right. So Chris?
Hi, I'm sorry I had to join late. And I just have a story about critical race theory and Ron DeSantis. I've been a teacher in predominantly African-American schools for many years. I have worked with a colleague who is a Republican, and he even ran for office. So he is, you know, entrenched in the Republican Party, and he is a Ron DeSantis supporter. And I said, you know, we ran a civil rights project together. We team taught many times. Nobody is more, you know, has said more things about race and taught Toni Morrison. And he's been with me through, you know, everything. And I do not hold anything back when I teach. We are studying the worst parts of history, etc. So I say to this Republican, I said, now, did I hurt anybody? You know, because this critical race theory law that's being proposed would definitely silence me. And did I hurt any of our white students? Did I hurt any of our Hispanic students? Blah, blah. He said, absolutely not. And I said, well, if this law is not written to silence me, what is it about? And he said, it's really about no teachers. It's about every person in Florida has had a teacher that hurt them, or that, you know, they felt they had gotten an unfair grade from, or, you know, they thought was a bad teacher. And he said that activates in people this idea that, you know, teachers to righteous rage about some teacher that harmed them for some reason. And I had never even thought of that, because I was still intent that this law that DeSantis is pushing was really about silencing issues of race. And he said, no, it is just a popularity ploy.
It's also just something that, it's also, Chris, sorry to cut you off. It's also just something people don't understand. What the hell is critical race theory, right? Like, this is the thing that really blows my mind is you talk to the people who are ranting about it, and you ask them for it, and they'll tell you that it's about hating America. They'll tell you that it's about being saddened by our past and all this other stuff, but they can never give you a pretty articulate actual response as to what it is, you know? So it's one of those things that's like, it's too complicated to explain. I'm a pretty smart person. I had not really heard of this until DeSantis started banging the drum about this. By the way, for folks who are interested, there's a great Daily Show piece, probably a little too long. I just put it in the chat. This is literally how I educated myself on this. And then at work, we had conversations around it. It's actually a really good piece. It's not just like a comedy thing. It's like smart. But this is a great like political tactic, because there's always the old phrase that if you're explaining, you're losing, right? Like, political slogans should be pretty self-evident and pretty obvious to people. The more we have to explain what critical race theory is, the more you can see eyes start to glaze over. And oh well, it's this way that we can analyze it. Like you're losing people. But if I'm able to say, oh, it's this thing that says you hate America, you don't like our past, you're embarrassed by it, you're ashamed of being an American, that's like this. I don't have to think about it that way. So truly, like what I always say to folks is, and I love the way you presented it, like here's an example of it. Where's the harm, right? Where is the difficulty? Where is the impact of this? And what would you do differently? How would you teach this differently? How would you approach this differently? Christine, sorry, I think you were next.
I thank you so much for the work that you do and for your time here tonight and dealing with all these really important issues. It's really great. I guess, do you have any thoughts on campaign finance reform, not just overturning Citizens United, but actually, like some other countries do, complete public financing of campaigns? And also, do you have any thoughts on mandatory voting, like some other countries do as well? So that's it, just if you have any thoughts on those issues.
Yeah, so mandatory voting is one of those things that when I was younger, I was always like, yeah, that sounds right. And as I've gotten older, I'm like, is this actually what would be beneficial? Right? I always feel like we live in a country where whenever, vaccines are a great example of this, whenever people are compelled to do something, our country tends to buck at every turn on it. So I don't know that that'll work. I like the idea of a national holiday. If people want to engage with the process, great. If their version of voting is by not engaging with the system, okay, right? But give people a paid holiday where they have the ability to go out and do and express it and do whatever they want on that front. So I don't know. I've seen some mixed, and I also saw like that even in some of these places, natives tend to be the group that most gets fined for this. So putting additional barriers or potential harms in front of the native population is not something I love traditionally. So like I said, I would make it a holiday, and then if people choose to engage, great. But you know, every time that I see us trying to compel people to do something, it usually backfires on us, even literally from the plague. So that's what I would say on that front. Campaign finance reform, I think it's a great idea. I think Citizens United, and I say this as somebody who literally I benefit from working on this side of things. Look, do I think it's helpful for me, not just professionally, because obviously yes, professionally, but also from my lens, do I think that the way that this ruling has allowed for things to open up is helpful in my communicating with our organization really works on lifting the voices of people of color and impoverished communities. Yes. Do I think that is a good enough reason to tell you and lie to you that we shouldn't have campaign finance reform? No. You know, there are other ways to be able to do this work. There are other communication tactics, and necessity is the mother of all invention. We will figure it out on our end, how to talk to these communities. But at the end of the day, Citizens United has really sort of helped poison our politics in a way that it still blows my mind that that the Supreme Court thought that it was a form of expression, and that it would not inalienably harm the way that our country is run. So I don't know if that's enough of an answer, but that's, you know. James?
Yeah, just a quick question, because I think I missed some of the beginning. Do you write anything, or have you published anything like on a blog or anything?
I mostly not. I put out usually one memo a month, and it is purely from a very partisan sort of lens. We're literally going to be putting out our next one, I think next week, or I'm putting out my next one next week. Actually, that is, if I didn't have this, that is probably what I would be working on right now. And you'll hear some of the stuff that I just said in that memo, because the thing that I'm talking about is race and voter suppression so in this memo. This worked out magnificently well for my work research as well. Let me see if I...
What organization are you referring to?
So I work for Community Change Action.
Okay.
And here is the link to, I think this is the last one that I wrote. So this one was still hopeful in that I thought maybe, just maybe, we might pass Build Back Better. You can always find this stuff on the website. It's on there. But yeah, I work for an organization. The C3 arm of it is called Community Change. And then the C4, which is on the more political side of it, is called community change action. We are not creative. This is what almost every organization does. You've heard of Planned Parenthood, but if you want to know where Planned Parenthood's political work is, it comes from Planned Parenthood action, you know? That's how you'll always be able to distinguish the more political side to the more nonprofit side of things.
All right, well, thank you for that.
Yeah. Carol.
I really like what you said about messaging, and also what Chris and Kerry about how do you talk to these people. And I wanted to share something that I kind of stumbled across, which is perspective taking. I have kind of a hobby of listening to right-wing radio and reading, Twitter, right-wing Twitter and things like that. And I noticed that, there's certain patterns of communication, and there's certain messages that keep getting said over and over and over again. But it helps me in two ways. One, it tones me down. I'm pretty progressive, but I have learned not to always wave a red flag in front of a bull, and to be more like a wise person who can address what you said. And the other thing is that I can hear the commonalities in what's being said. I can get behind what's being said and see where they're really coming from. So I think that messaging is a lot more important than, I really appreciated what Perry said about getting all these emails that make it sound like a team, the red team, the blue team, and we're clashing now. We got to win and all that. I think that, especially I think with females, I think it turns a lot of people off.
Yeah, women are way more collaborative than men. So that like, it does not surprise me to see that language is less effective with women than it is with men in any way, shape, or form. And it's true. Too much of the fundraising, too much of the communications that we put out for one to another is just like, oh, my enemy is saying X and is doing Y, so we have to counter that. It's not good politics. It's not good for the country in the long run. Glima?
Yeah, just quickly, that PBS post that I put up, they were talking about psychological appeal, so sort of to take off on what Carol was saying, but also what Chris was saying. Somebody that's Republican may have so much in common with you. My daughter passed away about 7 years ago from drug overdose or drug mix. So whenever I hear a story from Virginia about kids that, white populations that are being drugged up and are addicted, like my heart goes out to that. I don't care if they're white or red or whatever. So it's also something that I teach in my labor studies class, and West Virginia and the miners, and how hard they fought, harder than anybody else in American labor, to have their rights. So it's the same population that's now being attacked by addiction and drugs, and the whole idea about despair, that people are riled up to become violent because they don't see anything in the system that's allowing them hope. So maybe that's why, it's not just messaging. It's like, what are you going to do as progressives? What are the solutions that you're going to put forward? These people are desperate. They have no health care. They have no jobs. Like, what the F are we going to do? I'm not hearing that message. It's too wishy-washy. Like, give me a program. Like with Trump, he said, we're going to build whatever. We're going to make America greater. That has a lot of psychological appeal. So, come on, Democrats, get off your high horses and give us a message that has psychological appeal for Americans who are desperate. So that's my point.
Yeah, it's also just shocking to me how even when we pass really good policy, no one knows about it. There was recently a poll that was done where 87% of respondents, when they went in and they actually looked at the IRS filings, benefited from the American Rescue Plan. Of that 87%, 27% said that they had gotten benefits from the American Rescue Plan, and 57% said that not only had they not received anything, but in fact that they had not, that they did not think that they would ever receive anything that would be helpful to them during this time. So what that means is there's roughly a 60% gap of people who actually benefited from this and who knew that they were benefiting from this. That tells you something about how weak our messaging is, how weak our communications is, and how little it sticks in people's brains. And this was like this was a bill where people, yes, the $1,400, let's be honest, that's almost an embarrassing way to try to help people out. Like, it is what it is, right? But people also received a child tax credit for the first time in the history of this country, right? That's $300 a month for every child that you have. And if depending if they're under 5 or over 5, it changes a little bit. Put that over the course of a year, that's $3,600 that people saw going into their bank account. It's something that now they're not receiving as of January because it expired and it wasn't codified into law. There's a real gap and a real set of missed opportunities when you can tell that Democratic policies are much more popular than Republican policies. But the moment that either a party label gets affixed to them, there's clearly a branding problem, right? You say it's a Democratic policy, you see the numbers tank. And then the second part to it is, even when the policies which are popular and are helpful to people and are populist in their nature are passed, they end up really sort of falling apart. It's one of the things that always shocks me. And it always feels like the difference between Democrats and Republicans are that Democrats always want to take the temperature, whereas the Republicans are willing to change the temperature, right? And to me, it's the way that they approach the way that they actually talk to communities and meet them where they are at, and then say, okay, well, here's where we're going. The person who I mentioned earlier, Anat Shenker Osorio, who did the race class narrative, I'm gonna plug her book. I get nothing from this, I promise. This is just an Amazon link, and I'm sure it's available at news stores. I've got the book somewhere around here, specifically around the economy. This book came out in 2012, and I still find myself reading it fairly frequently with inflation and everything else that's going on. It's really, really helpful. But one of the things that she always says is that Democrats love talking about the ingredients inside of the bag, right? And that they never spend any time talking about the brownie, which is the end product of it. And so she always goes, well, when you're at the store, and this is the psychological piece, right? When you're at the store, do you read the ingredients on the box? Is there a big picture of all the ingredients on the box? Or is there a picture of a goddamn brownie, right? Like, which one is it? What are you trying to sell people? And too often we get lost in, oh, well, the filibuster and this, and we don't tell people, well, here's what we're going to deliver for you after election day. And it's like clear and cut, you know? I think that's the difference. It's too often we're lost in stats and numbers and things that make us feel intellectually really good, but that don't necessarily drive people and motivate them and push them to a place of trying to find success on that front. Christine, thoughts on Spanish language radio misinformation in Florida? I have nothing that I'm willing to say professionally because because the level of purposeful disinformation and misinformation in the state of Florida in Spanish. My parents talk to me about this all the time. I know Abel on here has unfortunately had to listen to a good chunk of this as well. He and I talk about this fairly frequently. This is what happens when the Fair Doctrine Act is not applied in a smart way, and then just removed altogether. But it's pretty obvious that it's very coordinated in the way that it does things. And it's also smart by the Republicans and conservatives that they are funding that infrastructure. It's also really offensive to me that Democrats haven't put in any information or any money behind trying to really tackle that. And when they do, it's like advertising. So again, we talk about trusted messengers and leveraging relationships, but if there aren't hosts who people can talk to, right, or who they can identify with, who they're not hearing those voices every single day, then you're just paying for a radio ad that will, we call it decay. People forget about things, right? So the radio ad is just going to decay and people are going to forget whatever it is. Whereas if it's a trusted messenger who you're listening to every day on your drive to work or from work, you're developing a relationship with that radio personality. You're trusting them more and more, even as you're hearing stuff that has no basis in reality oftentimes. Perry, for why do the Dems suck at messaging? That is a multi-hour, multi-day course. But I do think it's those principles. One, being stuck in our own heads. Two, too often not being willing to explain what the end result is on the policy side. And then I think the other piece is really just, we don't have a surround sound media ecosystem the way the Republicans do. They've got Fox News, they've got right-wing radio, and every time that there's been a sort of liberal alternative to this, Air America probably is the best known amongst the radio networks. It's where Al Franken and some of the others who are now on MSNBC really cut their teeth. It just doesn't take off the same way, you know? So whether that's because too many of us are younger and listening to podcasts, or too many folks are happy watching MSNBC, I don't know, but the reach just isn't there the way that it is for the right. Chris?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this idea that Republican messaging is so powerful, in the sense that, you know, I used to kind of just think suckers fell for it. And my sister is in that category because, you know, her self-interest has nothing to align with the Republicans. But I have a couple of Democratic friends, and they keep saying things that come right off of right-wing radio. I mean, a right-wing messaging. You know, they said something like, you know, well, why did he say a Black woman that's only 6%? I'm like, no, women are 50%. You know, when Sandra Day O'Connor was coming on, they didn't say she just represents, you know, white women named Sandra. You know, it like, and or, you know, so a smart person is repeating Ted Cruz or whoever. And another smart person was saying, you know, Biden is supposed to be a centrist, but he's not governing from the center. And, you know, have you read AOC's website? I'm like, oh, I'm sorry. What legislation has actually gone through from AOC? Is she a real threat? And, you know, what has Joe done? How is infrastructure not centrist? When I confront my Democratic friends who are repeating Republican talking points, they will back down because they realize, you know, how full of shit they are. But they say it. And so I know it's working on them because they're here in a conversation that I didn't ask them to bring up this stuff, and they're bringing up their talking points.
Yeah, it's always shocking, right? And we hear it fairly frequently, and we get lost in that conversation. One of the other things that I always end up harping on is, like, the dumbest thing Democrats do is that we agree to debate on our opponent's terms, right? Like, it just happens every single time, and it's why we don't win on any of these things. Like, to me, yeah, I could argue about that, or I could just say, look, Trump said he was going to nominate a woman. There was no uproar. Let's move on, right? It is time for representation for black women in this country. There's never been a single one, right? Like, you can have that conversation. The fact that you have senators out here talking about wanting a nominee who knows a law book from a J. Crew catalog. That's an actual quote from a senator in Louisiana. I don't know if you're aware of this. This is his response to Biden saying that he wanted basically saying, like, a black woman's too dumb to be able to distinguish from a J. Crew, a law book from a J. Crew catalog. This is an actual response. Like, we leave a lot of the Republican phrases to history, and then we end up digging in instead on the stupidities that or the invented stupidities that the right wing starts to use, and it's poor politics, it's poor messaging, and it's a poor way to approach this. You know, instead of saying, hey, like, let's argue about why it's 6%, only 6% of the whatever the profession, right, would qualify for this. Why don't we have a conversation around, like, is the problem that it's a Black Supreme Court justice that's potentially going to be nominated, or is the problem actually that it's like a progressive justice being nominated to replace a progressive? And what does that actually mean for you in your life? Like, how would a Black woman being in this position be different than when Breyer was in the seat? And how do we ensure, and like, is that going to make a legitimate difference in your life? Or is this just another way to detract from the fact that in 2017 there were tax cuts that were passed that benefited businesses, right? And now, like, we're seeing some of the states really start to bounce back from that only now because of the American Rescue Plan that passed and the infrastructure bill that passed. We always give into their talking points and we never pivot back to the things that are actually helpful for us to be able to have those conversations. And so instead of having a conversation around what it is that's going to make a difference in people's lives, which is why people are like, politics, I'm turned off to that. That doesn't matter. We always end up instead being part of the circus show about, you know, what was the latest Trump tweet, or what did Morning Joe end up saying that pissed people off or whatever.
Well, I think we should probably let Franco go. You haven't even taken one sip of water yet. I want to thank you so much for sharing your experience and your messaging, point of view, etc. It was so enriching. Does anyone else have something to say at the very last minute?
Can I just say, Democrats Club, South Democrats Club meeting at the Unitarian Universalist Church at 7 p.m. on Monday. Would love to see you all there. We're headed back to our home, our longtime home on that front. So, like I said, we're hopeful to see you all there on behalf of the club. And we're going to be doing a lot of voter registration events. I believe we're doing some of that actually at the Coconut Grove Arts Festival this weekend and things like that. So if you're worried about the state of American democracy, get involved. We're working on it, one voter at a time.
Thank you, Franco. Bravo. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you.
Thanks, y'all. Appreciate it.
All right.
And Perry, I put the address in there for you.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Franco
Great.
and Glima for putting it together.
Thanks.
Yeah.